My name is Peter Czajkowski, and I am the creator of the Story Engine and the Story Engine Deck of Worlds, and the owner of a very needy dog named Oben. Hey, buddy. So today he is going to join us for this video demo. Aren't you, buddy? We are going to demo Shared Hearths and Common Creeds, which is a specific expansion from the Creative Expansion block. The Creative Expansions are designed to help you deepen your understanding of your setting and explore it through lore and asking really interesting questions about the world. In particular, this is the Culture Keyholes expansion. I call them Culture Keyholes because these questions are specific and narrow, but when you turn them over in the right way, they unlock larger truths about your world, the people who live there, and the values, lifestyle, traditions, culture, and customs that they live by. Now, this expansion contains 60 cards, each of which has 4 world-building questions focused on different aspects of personal life, values, community, and governance. It also comes with a booklet that comes with all the guidelines that I'm about to share with you, and we're going to explore one specific way to use this deck. However, there are, as you'll see in the guidebook, 3 different ways that you can deploy these cards. Your first option is actually using the Culture Keyholes cards as you're building your micro setting. So if you look at the earlier videos in the series where we created a micro setting called the Camp of Ghosts, and then later where we created a micro setting called Rogue Island, if you watch those videos, you can imagine how, rather than drawing these cards now after creating the setting, we could have drawn them as we created the setting. If you are using the cards while you create the setting, my recommendation is to draw them almost as a 7th card type. So once you've laid down your Advent card, which is usually the last card in creating a micro setting, you're going to draw, for a simple micro setting, you're going to draw 1 keyhole card, and for a complex micro setting, you're going to draw 2 keyhole cards. And you can choose one or both of those for the complex micro setting. The advantage to using this style of creation is that it lets you ask these world-building questions really while the iron's hot, while you're already thinking about this area and the people who live there. Another option for using this deck is just to use them like flashcards. You can draw them and just think about these questions as you look at your world map, or if you don't even own the deck of worlds, but you have created your own setting just independently, you can draw these cards and ask yourself these questions to really flesh out who lives in your world, what they care about, what motivates them and drives them, what keeps them up at night. But today, the method that we're going to use is the second one covered in the guidebook, which is to finish creating your world map or finish creating a series of micro settings and then draw keyhole cards and decide which settings they belong to. The advantage to using this method is that, number 1, it lets you create a lot faster. Rather than slowing down to ask these questions as you're building, you can create a big, interesting area and then start to layer in this nuance. If you're a writer who likes to write a lot and quickly and not worry about obsessing over every line, and then you come back in later to edit and refine, this is probably going to be a more natural style for you. Second advantage to using this style of creation is that it gives you more options for pairing keyhole questions with settings that really fit them. Rather than being limited by the random draw that you had for each setting as you created it, you can draw the card and decide which micro setting in your world map really would be illuminated by answering this question. Now, you can watch the earlier videos in the series to get to know the setting that we've already created, but I'm going to give you a very brief description of the 2 micro settings that we've created in our world map so far. The Camp of Ghosts is located at the top of a cliff, and it's a camp of retired adventurers who have lived long, who have finished their glory days, who have finished their service to the realm, and just want to retire in the company of people who understand the path that they've walked and live the quiet life. However, there's a lot of new and young adventurers, a lot of greenhorns out there who want to get to know all of the secrets and the combat styles and the survival tactics that help these adventurers live so long. And these young heroes have formed their own commune at the base of the cliffs where the camp is located. And these people will regularly make attempts to climb the cliff and to get to talk to and learn from the heroes at the top, even though those heroes might not be willing to share their knowledge. These cliffs are covered with very protective and territorial mountain goats who will try and headbutt off anybody who ascends the cliffs. It's a bit of a naturally occurring security system. Now, the Camp of Ghosts and this greenhorn camp, or this camp of fledgling heroes, is located next to the ocean, and just offshore is something called Rogue Island. Rogue Island is a opportunistic academy of tricksters and deceivers and rogues and thieves who decided that if people are journeying all this way to try and learn from these adventurers who don't even want to teach them, maybe they could catch some business on the sly by taking some of the disillusioned and disenfranchised young adventurers and offering to teach them how to become wise to the ways of the world, how to learn stealth and trickery and combat gambits. Originally, the Rogue Academy was actually located elsewhere, so they relocated here specifically to seize the opportunity of recruiting some of these greenhorns. It's a bit of a gambling hub. I've decided that there's actually a gambling-based economy, so it's not just barter and it's not just purchasing. There's always a bit of a gamble or some kind of game or deception involved in every transaction that they do. Also, there's a very elaborate etiquette system. There's very much an honor amongst thieves type of code that everybody there lives by that we're going to learn probably more about. The island itself is actually a dormant volcano. It's called the volcano that sleeps, so it's been a while since it last erupted, but it's definitely an area of a concern, and it's a knowing risk that the rogues took to set up here. The advent card that we drew at the last session is a very interesting one, which is that a prominent figure is being exposed as a fraud. In this case, I've chosen to interpret this that the leader of the Rogue Academy, someone who claims to be one of the most accomplished deceivers, tricksters, and fraudsters in the business, who's going to pass on their secrets, actually turns out not to have told all that many lies. In fact, I'm now just having the idea the founder of the Academy claimed to have convinced people of all these heroic deeds that they did, claimed that they managed to pull off the greatest swindle in history, which is convincing people that they slayed this mighty beast and courted this mighty emperor or empress and achieved all these things. And then when they founded the Rogues Academy, they said, like, surprise, I didn't do any of those things. All of those were hoaxes, and this is to show you the power of deception. But then the thing that's found out to be the lie is that they actually did do those things. So they're claiming to teach you how to be able to tell these grand lies and execute them effectively. But in fact, they had to do all the real hard and honest work to achieve those goals, and that is how they've been found out. They've been found out as a fraud of a fraud because they actually did the thing. Those are our two settings. That's Camp of Ghosts and that's Rogue Island. And now we are going to learn a little bit about them by drawing some keyhole cards. What is their belief in the influence of celestial bodies? In other words, what do they think about the stars, planets, and moon and how they affect life? What areas of learning do they focus on? What type of knowledge do they value? What do they admire most about outsiders? What do they consider a delicacy? So I like the idea of what areas of learning do they focus on, because in some ways, all three of these locations, the Greenhorn Camp, the Camp of Ghosts, and Rogue Island, are in some ways concerned with education and training and passing on information. I am going to deploy this card on the Camp of Ghosts, and that's because I do want to learn more about what the heroes are doing with their spare time in retirement. What does somebody who has, faced some of the biggest threats in the world do when they are trying to recover or retire or retreat from a life where they're always under threat? Someone who has spent their entire life learning ways of war and ways of strength, what would they do if they didn't have to be strong anymore? I think that's a really interesting question. So I'm going to tuck that one under the Camp of Ghosts. I think it would be very interesting if they focused on healing, and not healing in the magic sense or the battlefield sense of like being a medic and stitching up wounds. They're doing almost this like group therapy or group counseling or co-counseling thing where they talk each other through the traumas that they lived in life. A lot of these people have suffered wounds that have changed their bodies and their relationship to their bodies and their body's abilities. That's something that is going to have a fundamental shift in the way that you operate in the world. A lot of these people have borne psychological scars for much of their life from things that they've seen or things that they've done that have been really heavy burdens to carry. I really like the idea that the Camp of Ghosts is actually, they've chosen that name to scare people off almost because they want to make it seem like we've faded from the world. But in fact, it's a place where they try to come alive again, or they try to experience healing and letting go of some of these wounds and being able to accept themselves as they are and for the things that they've done and find peace in the autumn years of their life. I think that's a really beautiful concept. Now I'm going to pause for a moment to talk about a few of the finer points and considerations when using this deck, because when you're asking questions about culture, you can get into some sticky situations. These questions around culture, especially where the cultures in your world might mirror real life cultures, cultures that have historically been misunderstood or appropriated, you just want to proceed with a lot of caution, sensitivity, and care to make sure that the writing that you're doing, the creation that you're doing, isn't causing harm or furthering damaging stereotypes. Anytime that you are interpreting a cue from this deck, from the Culture Keyholes deck, I would encourage you to consider two questions, or at the end of a creative session, to think through these two questions just to make sure that the way that you've used the deck has been effective and nuanced. The first question that I would ask is this: what assumptions does the question on the card make? And by this I mean, what, by even asking this question, is being added to your world and put into your world as canon or as law because of the very nature of the question. So for example, what areas of learning do they focus on assumes that they focus on learning. That's an assumption. What if the heroes are kind of done learning? They don't want to have to take on new skills. They spent their whole life trying to take on new skills, and now they just want to enjoy the skills they've already learned. That's an example of challenging the assumption of the card. The second question that's valuable to ask yourself anytime you're using a Culture Keyhole card is who else in this setting might give a different answer. And by that I mean that most settings where there are people, most inhabited spaces, are inhabited by a variety of people. And in any culture other than a hive mind or a culture where there's literally clones or robot clones of each other, there's going to be a variety of opinions, there's going to be a variety of values, a spectrum of beliefs that you see there. And so the answer that you give to the question that you're asking might be different from one hero to another hero. Already, this question kind of, again, assumes a homogeneity of response in the fact that all the heroes who come to this camp are interested in healing. What if instead this was just where heroes got to do all those hobbies that they never took on in life because they didn't have time to paint or read or dance or learn to play instruments? Maybe this is a place where the types of learning that they focus on are just ones that are self-nourishing. Maybe the answer to this question is actually a series of answers depending on who we're asking. Folding these questions into your world building and into the way that you answer world building questions is just going to give you a lot more nuance and texture and difference and realism in the world that you're creating. And with that, let's draw our second Keyhole card. When do they approve of violence? A really interesting and loaded question. How do they treat people who live next door? How and why would they make a toast? Where do they go when they travel? I'm interested in the question of how do they treat people who live next door. With the Camp of Ghosts, I imagine there's a certain amount of respect for privacy and not asking people questions about their past if they don't want to answer them. With the Camp of Greenhorns or Fledgling Heroes at the base, I imagine that there's this sense of common striving that they share. So maybe there's a lot of interest or investment in each other's success and maybe a little bit of rivalry too. So the way that they treat people who live next door might almost be like fellow pilgrims or fellow seekers. And for the Rogue Islands, again, this elaborate etiquette system and this gambling hub, I think that there might be a rule where, like, kind of like in the card game Munchkin, like if you cheat and you get away with it, it's fine. I might actually use that card for Rogue Island. I'm also really interested in when do they approve of violence, both for Rogue Island, because if the goal is to try and deceive people, then violence might be a last resort and considered a bit of a blunt instrument for a group that otherwise prizes themselves on the intricacy of their lies and tactics. And I also think it'd be really interesting if the Camp of Ghosts has kind of like a peace treaty where anyone who comes here is expected not to fight, but there are specific clauses why someone might be able to draw a blade or cast a spell or hurt someone. I think I'm going to go with how do they treat the people who live next door in the Rogue Island, and I think I'm going to say that in their etiquette system, it's okay to steal, it's okay to lie, it's okay to cheat. The only rule is don't get caught. And if we revisit those two framing questions that I talked about earlier, what answers would you get depending on who you asked? I like the idea that there's this top-down code, this sort of thieves' honor, but I also like the idea that how that's interpreted is entirely up to each thief, to each rogue, and that their ability to defend their position on how they interpret it is a huge part of how it's interpreted. So part of the code itself is that the code is what you make of it. And now let's draw the third and final Keyhole card for our world map here. What qualities do they ascribe to their gods? What daily meals do they have? When they make a promise, what do they swear on? Where do they get their water from? Oh, these are all really interesting for all of the locations. So what daily meals do they have is something that I think would be so interesting to ask about the Camp of Ghosts. How communal is their dining when these are people who have collectively agreed to retire from public life? Meals are a moment where often there's communion, but also often there's privacy. And the Camp of Ghosts is a place where, again, there's this blurring of the public and private, because these public figures have come to be private and to respect each other's privacy. But meals are often a gathering time, so how would they navigate that? That's a really interesting question, but when they make a promise, what do they swear on? To me is fascinating for the Rogue Island and for this Rogue Academy, because how do you convince someone you're not lying when we all know that the premise of us being here is to learn how to lie better? When you swear at the Rogue Academy, you swear on your dishonor. You don't swear on the fact that you tell the truth, you swear to the person on the fact that you can be relied on to lie. And that is how they know that they can, if not trust you, then predict the fact that you will be consistently deceptive. Maybe the answer is that part of each thief's studies is learning what they can swear on, that they feel comfortable violating that promise, but that is still convincing enough that they can convince someone else that they're telling the truth. Maybe it's about finding that thing just on the border of what they hold sacred, that they're willing to cast off and make part of their deception if it's convenient to do so, but that holds enough value that people will at least give some consideration to the fact that they might be telling the truth. So I'm gonna go with when they make a promise, what do they swear on? And I'm gonna say that's a question that they actually discuss and engage engage with in their studies, because learning how to swear on things and how to appear trustworthy is really important to them. But I also like the idea that there's this running joke that they swear on their dishonor rather than their honor. And there we go. We have managed to even more deeply flesh out these two micro-settings that I thought were already really interesting and layered and nuanced, but now I know so much more about them. If you do want to check out the Culture Keyholes expansion and get a little bit of a closer look at it, you can find it on the deckofworlds.com website. You can also find me at StoryEngineDeck on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram if you've got questions or you just want to talk shop about world building. There should be videos appearing here and there and everywhere, linking you to other videos in this demo series and other resources for world building. Feel free to check those out and see how we created this setting and also other things that we can create using the same base building blocks. Thank you so much for your time and attention and your creative energy, and I can't wait to see what you go on to create with the new world building tools you're picking up.